economic theory predicts this too, that globalization creates winner, it creates losers. There's nothing surprising about this. I think where we have failed is in producing political remedies. Until the 1990s, policymakers tended to view the world economy as a means to more prosperous, more inclusive society. For 3-4 decades, we had significant expansion of global trade and global investment. And for the most part, that was a very good kind of globalization because it increased opportunities in a context of full employment for vast segments of society in the advanced countries. So those was a good period for globalization. After the 1990s, increasingly, globalization became an end in itself, and it was the turn of domestic economies and societies to adjust to globalization. The practical expression of this change in the mindset was the type of trade agreements that were being signed. The WTO was the first big break with the 1994. For the first time, we had a global trade agreement that significantly reached into domestic policy, domestic regulations in terms of investment rules or in terms of intellectual property rules, in terms of subsidies in services, agriculture, and so forth. I think those were all expressions of what I have called hyper-globalization, a kind of globalization that begins to see the domestic economy in service of global markets rather than global markets in service of the domestic economy. So I think it created a kind of a delegitimized globalization, precisely not because globalization itself is something bad, but because of a particular path of globalization, particular means of approaching globalization that was largely driven by corporate interests, by financial institutions, by big tech and big pharma. And I think it became largely a domain of a small set of interests through the back door, so to speak, through international agreements in the area of trade, so-called trade. So I think we set the stage for a kind of a political backlash. I think it's a general consequence of the kind of globalization we've experienced, that globalization does not lift all boats. I think globalization has very asymmetric effects within an economy. That those firms and individuals with the skills and competences and the networks and the assets that can benefit from global markets do very well. In the case of Mexico, those firms that already were relatively productive, close to the American market, so they benefited greatly. But globalization generally has not been very good to, in the case of Mexico, to large parts of the agricultural sector, or to much of the manufacturing that was not particularly competitive or was not particularly productive. So there has been significant adverse shocks experienced by those. And Mexico is a particularly strong example of how parts of the country can benefit from globalization and global value chains, while the rest of the country falls progressively more and more behind. But this kind of phenomenon is happening essentially everywhere. So this is in the nature of globalization. I don't think we should be surprised. Economic theory predicts this too, that globalization creates winner, it creates losers. There's nothing surprising about this. I think where we have failed is in producing political remedies, better systems of compensation or transfers in countries that don't have that, like Mexico or the United States. Even in countries that do have better social transfer systems, like France, through much more active labor market policies that target the creation of good jobs, more extensive industrial policies that are employment-oriented. And those things have fallen out of favor because of preoccupation with liberal economic principles, but I think they will have to come back. I would certainly prioritize climate change, and I think any real action you can undertake domestically on the climate change front that potentially conflicts with WTO trade rules, I would say let's bend the trade rules so that we have action on the climate front. So that would mean, for example, border tax adjustments for countries that have stricter rules on carbon emissions and so forth, to ensure that their own firms are not disadvantaged by imports from countries where have more relaxed rules on carbon emissions or don't have carbon taxes. So those, I think, would be perfectly legitimate. I think most of the action on climate change realistically is going to happen through domestic action and not through international agreement. And I think different countries are going to be moving at very different speeds, as we are already seeing. Another area where there's a potential conflict is the use of subsidies in green technologies. So I think every economist would tell you that it's actually a good thing to subsidize green technologies. But those subsidies sometimes will conflict with global trade rules. That's another area I think that global trade rules should give way, and countries ought to be encouraged to subsidize green technologies. Regardless of the source, wherever we see good jobs disappearing, we have seen a rise in support for populism. There's a strong association between the geography of job losses linked to the China trade shocks and the geography of increased political support for the far right. It's not trade per se or globalization per se that's creating this increase in support for the far right, but it is that labor market insecurities and anxieties are linked to increased support for populists, and that could be because of trade, it could be because of automation, it could be because of deindustrialization, it could be because of decline in public services, as has been the case in Britain. I think for a variety of reasons, when we have adverse labor market developments, they tend to be correlated with support for the far right. I don't think we'll see the end of globalization, and I'm very hopeful that we could move towards a fairer and more sustainable globalization. So I think the issue is not whether globalization goes ahead or goes backwards, or whether we're for or against globalization. It's really about what kind of rules that we want. I want to live in a world that's globalized, but globalized with much better rules than we have crafted in the last 30 years.